today we are gonna go over quickly the British Empire and its rise and fall. This is just revision notes from the notes that we made in class for those of you that weren't here or those of you that want to look at it again. So I'm going to go through these points really quickly just so we can use it as revision for how power used to be with the British Empire and has shifted and we no longer have the power. So as you know, some of you in class, I talked about the song that we have, Royal Britannia, and the next line of that song is Britannia rules the waves. And the reason it says the waves is that we had a lot of ships during that time, and that's how we got to these places, but we'll talk a little bit more about the ships later on. So let's start our timeline about the 1800s. We had the British Empire is well underway during this time. The UK has got a very desirable climate, which means that it can grow crops, it can feed its people. It's got lots of raw materials, it's got oil, it's got gas, it's got lots of natural resources, which we know is a prerequisite for being a superpower. So although quite tiny, the UK has got lots and lots of advantages in terms of its desirable location. It's not landlocked, it can trade easily around because we've got coastline all around the UK. As I said before, it's got resources and it's got a good climate. So that's the position that we came from in the United Kingdom. Lots of raw materials, and also remember we talked about mercantilism, which is the fact that the king at the time allowed explorers to go off around the world in his name and bring back the goods and trade with those goods. So it was legal at the time for that to happen. And the empire is expanding. So we've got a nice smiley face there, say that the British Empire is expanding and we have a lot of power. In the 1950s, that power, in the 1850s I should say, that power was expanding still. We've got the Industrial Revolution happening about the 1850s and onwards, which meant that the manufacture of machinery and weapons is much easier because we have the steam engine, and those processes can be much more efficient, and that can be used to expand the empire further. It's rapidly expanding. That's bringing raw materials to the UK, but it's also enabling us to trade between countries and put our influence on those countries. So again, that leads to the expansion of the empire. So this carries on until the 1900s, and the 1900s, the beginning of the 1900s onwards for the next couple of decades, again, the empire is rapidly expanding. We've got the extension of the Industrial Revolution that's already kicked in. We've got places in North America, Canada, we've gone to places in Africa, we've obviously got the Indian areas in the Indian subcontinent in Asia, and we're expanding our empire, we're trading, we're gaining power, we're gaining influence within those places. 1935 onwards, for the next 10 years, we see a decline in the empire. And at that time, in 1935, there was a change in attitudes, a change of what was ethical and maybe what wasn't ethical. So people were maybe starting to question the validity of moving to these places and taking the resources, exploiting the labour, etc. So we've got a sea change a little bit in attitudes, which is then compounded by the fact in 1939 we've got World War II. So things are kind of put on hold, and the UK, along with the rest of Europe, is involved in the Second World War with Nazi Germany, and a lot of money is spent on that war and holding frontiers and putting troops everywhere in Europe, etc. So by the time 1945 comes and the Second World War is over, the UK, along with the rest of Europe, is more or less bankrupt. So it's very difficult for us to hold our positions within those empire places that we've been to, because it's very expensive to keep troops there, it's very expensive to keep trade going, etc. And when we've got no money, essentially. So this is when, along with the, like I said before, in the 1930s, when the idea and the ethics of having an empire was brought into question, that alongside having very little money left after the Second World War and having to put our money within the UK to rebuild all of those places that were destroyed, etc., then the empire starts to fall apart. And we know from what we've seen before is that 1945, that's when the Marshall Plan started, and the United States started to see that it had an opportunity to lend money through the World Bank, the start-up of the World Bank, that we start to see this power shift from the United Kingdom across the Atlantic into America, North America and the USA, because the USA saw that it had an opportunity to do this with all of Europe almost being bankrupt. So it was very hard to keep troops and armies then, it's very hard to maintain power. So the empire starts to crumble. Today, obviously, those countries and territories have mainly been given independence and given back, but as we talked about in class, you do have the remnants of this with the UK flag being present on lots of these places around the world. So the UK at this point, after the Second World War and onwards, is no longer a superpower, and that shift has begun to happen where that power has moved into the United States, and the United States now starts to take advantage of the fact of the positive factors that it has, namely large land area, huge population to act as a labour force, huge amounts of raw materials including oil and gas fields which you can use to produce energy, and a massive market within the European subcontinent, Western Europe, that it can sell its goods to and it can trade. So we see that power starting to shift from Europe into North America. So we're no longer a superpower, we no longer have the British Empire, and the British Empire has fallen.